Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends of land degradation neutrality. A warm welcome to all of you. My name is Alexander Müller. I'm the Managing Director of TMG, the think tank for sustainability based in Berlin, in Germany. I have the pleasure to open and to moderate this expert panel. The title of this panel is Just Transitions Towards Land Degradation Neutrality, with a focus on tenure rights for soil restoration. And I'm really happy to introduce to you, first of all, our speakers. And all of the speakers are also representing countries who are co-hosts of this session. So let me start with Mr. Michael Grake. He is the Director for Sustainable Supply Chains, Food and Rural Development in the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ, here in Germany. Michael, very warm welcome. Thanks for joining. I would also like to introduce to you Hanitra Rasafindra-Hanta. She is the Director of Reforestation, Landscape and Forest Management from the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development from Madagascar. Thank you very much for joining us. I would like to continue with Lucy Wambui Mganga, the Assistant Director for Multilateral Environmental Agreements in the Ministry of Environment and Forestry from Kenya, to be followed by Mr. Teddy Kamoto, the Deputy Director of Forestry Department of Forestry in the Department of Forestry in the Ministry of Forestry and Natural Resources from Malawi. Teddy Kamoto, warm welcome. And last but not least, Professor Alistair Sena Alinsato from Benin. He is the Cabinet Director in the Ministry of Planning and Development. Thanks a lot for joining us. Dear colleagues, dear friends, a very brief introduction from my side. We all know, and there's international agreement, that we need restoration of ecosystems, that land degradation neutrality is needed. But we know from experience that when international agreements get implemented on the ground, we have to deal with local and regional realities. And sometimes there are problems and sometimes there are conflicts. And therefore, this session is about how to use land tenure rights in order to achieve land degradation neutrality. Or to say it in the other way around, without taking into account local realities, land degradation neutrality cannot be achieved. Tenure rights, restoration, and land degradation neutrality are two sides of one coin. This is what we are talking about in this panel. And I'm happy to hand over to our first speaker for introducing this session, to Michael Grake from BMZ. And I would like to acknowledge and thank BMZ for having supported also financially this session and the whole project. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alexander, dear panelists and participants, for giving me the opportunity to give some opening remarks. Here in Berlin, it's still relatively early in the morning, 8 o'clock, the same in Benin. The folks from Eastern Africa, they already probably had their second cup of coffee or tea. But I think my role this morning is to do the wake-up call for everyone and to make sure everyone is aware of what we are facing here. And I thank TMG that you put solutions in the center of this panel. But let me briefly start. When waking up, people usually here in my family, I say the roof is on fire, get up out of the bed. So let me start with briefly elaborating on what we're facing as crises and how we should react. I think crisis mode is the word of our time. We discuss a lot of crises currently on a global level. And I think also in international cooperation and development, there's increasing awareness that COVID-19 had the effect that millions of people slipped back into extreme poverty, numbers of hunger, people suffering from hunger went up. So these are crises that are, I would say, still relatively well known. But I would like to draw attention at the beginning of one example of crisis that I think is too often overlooked. And so I turn to Madagascar on this. Yet the crisis that we face in Madagascar right now will be remembered as the first, in southern Madagascar, I must say, it will be remembered as the first hunger crisis that is, according to the World Food Programme, directly linked to climate change. And you know, this should change something in the awareness on how we are reacting on many of the questions of today. So while scientists are still discussing the extent to which climate change has contributed to this hunger crisis, I think it's important for us to focus on the scientific consensus on this and on some other issues as well. The losses of lives and livelihoods in Madagascar today, they are a precursor of what is to be expected if we don't deal with the climate crisis. So there's an urgent need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and all this. We've discussed that as well. But at the same time, we also need to strengthen our efforts to enhance vulnerable people's capacities to respond to these extreme weather events that we're facing. So we need to invest in adaptation and resilient food systems, foster rural livelihoods. And this implies also investing, and this is what brings us here together, in restoration of soils and landscapes. And soils and landscapes restoration, they are an integral part of rural development approaches. And I think when we want to address these multiple crises that we're facing, we need to apply the whole suite of cross-sectoral rural development approaches. And we need to focus on some of them that promise to be most effective. Soil and landscape restoration is clearly one of them. And in other words, you can simply put it, healthy soils and lands mean sustainable livelihoods. So why do we need to address land rights in this context? First and foremost, I would say investments in soil and land restoration, they take some time until they yield economic and social benefits. So to reduce the uncertainty for smallholder farmers investing in land, they need to secure land rights. Who is going to invest precious resources in soil restoration if they cannot be sure to be the one who will yield the benefits of this as well? So in particular, we think of poor smallholder farmers when we discuss about this. But obviously, investment decisions depend on a number of factors: market access, inclusive rural finance, agricultural extension services. All this is part of the solution as well. So in short, we need inclusive value chains for this. And to secure land rights alone might not be sufficient to realize investment in soil and land restoration, but they are a necessary condition. So many other things, we don't have to start with this if we don't put the first necessary conditions in place. Secure land rights creates an incentive to invest in soils. So my second point is the magnitude of the climate crisis demands fast responses at scale. Yet large-scale responses carry a risk for smallholder farmers. Often their land rights are not yet registered, let alone titled. So therefore, large-scale external investments in land restoration involve the risk of alienating people of their lands. And the experience with programs on, for example, reducing deforestation and forest degradation, RED, highlight some of these challenges. I would say that RED is an important contribution, but it's clearly not a silver bullet as a solution to all of our problems. And we need to learn from these experiences that we're making. So even if investments are well intended, they might lead to conflicts over land. So we need to avoid conflicts, and we have to seek the synergies between restoration and the people's rights. You know, I come from the Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development. We always try to put the perspective of people in the center of what we're doing. We don't want to save the planet. It's enough to save mankind, I would say. The planet will take care of itself in one way or another. So therefore, to make investments work for people and planet, we need to think of secure tenure rights as a basis for sustainable soil and land restoration. But how can we carry this forward this year? I think there's a number of opportunities that we have this year to advance this important agenda. In May, the UNCCD, the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, will hold its 15th COP, Conference of the Parties, will be in Côte d'Ivoire. So at the last UNCCD COP, parties adopted a land tenure decision. So this decision links principles on the responsible governance of tenure of land to national land degradation neutrality plans. It's a big achievement. In Africa, 52 countries have developed land degradation neutrality plans now. They show ambition and commitment. And the upcoming UNCCD COP will allow to take stock of what has been achieved since the adoption of the land tenure decision. And BMZ, my ministry, has supported the Global Soil Week and its partners to showcase that, in fact, secure land tenure and land degradation neutrality are, as you said, Alexander Müller, two sides of the same coin. And I'm looking forward to the presentations that we have on the results of this during our panel. There's second international momentum that we could use this year. This year, we also celebrate 10 years of voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of tenure of land. So let us jointly use this important global event to highlight the relevance of secure tenure rights for soil and land restoration. So there is some international momentum we should use this year. And I would add at the regional level, the Great Green Wall is a joint program by now, I think, 21 African countries. And its initial results are encouraging and show that change is possible. So we need these international processes, but we need to also show something that really works on the ground. And we have some hope that the Great Green Wall Initiative can be one of these examples. And what is so often relevant, I would like to stress here as well, in the end, it's all about African leadership on these problems and political will to really mobilize the resources, put the right rules and regulations in place. So partners like BMZ can play their role. So I'm glad that we have a purely African panel here now where we can listen and see some of the spirit of leadership of what's happening in these countries. So let me conclude by saying that the German government is not only talking about these issues, we are also supporting partners significantly in their efforts to restore soils and landscapes and to secure legitimate land tenure rights. Two examples I would like to mention briefly at the end. Our global program, Soil Rehabilitation and Protection for Food Security, for instance, works with 7 African countries to support investments in healthy soils. So far around 500,000 hectares have been protected and rehabilitated. And simultaneously, our global program, Responsible Land Policy, has so far safeguarded secure access to land for around 700,000 people in 8 partner countries. So we try to support African initiatives with our means on this. But once again, in the end, it's always the political will and the energy on the continent that drives these processes. So, and last but not least, I should mention that Germany and the European partners have been, I think, helpful in the negotiations of the aforementioned UNCCD land tenure decision. So Germany is committed to continue to work with its partners to achieve healthy soils and sustainable landscapes for food security and poverty reduction. And I wish us now an interesting panel on this, and I think I'm still on time. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Perfect start. Let me underline 2 of your key messages. The first message is this session is about solutions. Our partners and co-hosts, Kenya, Benin, Madagascar, Malawi, they have set ambitious LDN targets. And together with TMG and with technical support from GIZ, we have done work on the ground how to achieve it. So in Benin and Kenya, we have done participatory mapping to find out who is using which land. In Malawi, we have started with a household survey, and soon we are going to begin the concrete work on the ground in Madagascar. So the second message you have presented is that LDN can only be successful if it takes into account the rights of the people, the land rights of the people, the customary rights, the secondary rights. So land tenure and LDN have to go hand in hand in order to achieve land degradation neutrality and to improve the livelihoods of the people. In the end, we want to improve the health of the planet and the health of the people. And in this regard, I'm really happy to announce our first speaker, Lucy Wambui Nganga. I have already introduced her in the beginning. She is the Assistant Director for Multilateral Environmental Agreements in the Ministry of Environment and Forestry in Kenya. Lucy, we are looking forward to your presentation. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, colleagues and those present. I want to give my New Year greetings. The New Year is still young, and thank the organizers for putting this together. I'll start by saying that Kenya has ratified the UNCCD Convention with great commitment to domesticate the convention decisions. And further to this, also we have developed our land degradation neutrality report, like a speaker said that quite a number of African countries have done that. In this report, Kenya has outlined both the very national and sub-national targets that we aspire to achieve. And just to mention a few is that we would want to achieve and maintain a forest cover of 10%. We would want to increase by 16% the net land productivity of forests in other areas. We would also want to increase the soil carbon in croplands by over 300,000 tons. And even at the grassroots, the ecosystems of river basins like the Ewasonyiro, Tana River, Adu River, and including the Rift Valley and the Lake Victoria catchment areas, that those targets are very well articulated in our degradation report, our degradation neutrality reports. To say here that the forest conservation, Kenya has a Forest Conservation and Management Act of 2016. And this framework provides for the management of forests and forest resources as a shared function between Kenya Forest Service and forest adjacent communities through agreements with what we call as CFAs or community forest associations. This framework do exist. But then when we look at the Red Kenya situation in Kenya, the situation is such that the Constitution upholds that all the land in Kenya belongs to the people of Kenya, collectively as a nation, as communities, and as individuals. And therefore, it brings up the classification of public land, private land, community land, where now the forests are integrated. However, in implementing our land degradation neutrality target work, we encounter a number of these challenges, and the challenges, some of which are earlier speakers have still commenced alluding into them. You look at the communities adjacent to the forests, and you see that there are constant conflicts with other stakeholders who manage the forests, and in such circumstances, the land rights are definitely likely to be infringed. You also look at the UNCC land tenure rights decision that has just been spoken into, which did not set specific targets to guide parties or countries in the implementation. And this presents again a challenge in monitoring what are these tenure rights and how are they related to the LDN implementation and how do they get monitored, reported, and assessed. You look at the grassroots management structures at these communities and living next to the adjacent to the forests. And sometimes you look at the very local nature in which their structures are. And you find that they are far-fetched to be able to influence key policy decisions in forest management. Looking at the case study that was done in Kenya in a forest called Kireta by the TMG research, a number of lessons are around here, and we can pick a few of them because of time. And you look at that one is that communities living adjacent to the forest are highly dependent on secure access to forest resources for household, food security, and other incomes. And in some cases, there are degradation neutrality forest protection measures that are implemented are likely to step into the community's land tenure rights, and this leads to conflict and negative impact to livelihoods. Existing co-management mechanisms in these environments provides for community tenure rights despite the limited capacities of community organization and weak conflict resolution mechanism. This is an area that we need to put more effort in and enhance. The potential conflict of national policy restoration directives with established local co-management mechanism. And an example here is where when a government issues a moratorium on logging activities, some of these policy directions are not integrating the rights of communities living adjacent to the forests. And the results, we can actually already imagine what that is. Lastly, the outcomes of the land degradation activities do not necessarily mention the impact of the forest tenure rights of forest adjacent communities. And the big reason here is being that there is lack of connectedness in the development of the degradation neutrality targets and the land tenure rights. And I think this is an area that needs enhancement, integration, and mainstreaming. And therefore, I would say this, it is important, therefore, to establish a framework that promotes the achievement of land degradation neutrality targets and soil restoration while integrating and securing community land tenure rights. And that's the only way we'll achieve or promote responsible land governance. I submit, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for this presentation on how achieving LDN has to be based on securing land tenure rights for people and informing us about the example of people living in forests. Thanks a lot. We will come back to this question later. Now it is my pleasure to announce Professor Alistair Senna Alinsato. He is the Cabinet Director in the Ministry of Planning and Development from Benin. So we are moving from Kenya directly to Benin. Professor, the floor is yours for the next 5 minutes to inform us about your experience with achieving land degradation neutrality and implementing this target in your country. Thanks for joining us.
Merci beaucoup, Alexander. Merci d'associer le Bénin à cet exercice. Comme vous l'avez dit, l'implication du ministère du Plan et du Développement dans le suivi des questions en lien avec la neutralité.
Thank you very much, Alexander.
C'est le ministère du Plan et du Développement au Bénin qui coordonne la mise en œuvre des objectifs du développement durable. Et comme vous savez, l'ODD 15, notamment la cible 15.3, fait partie donc de ces ODD et contient le sujet qui est en débat ce matin. Donc, c'est pour le Bénin une très grande préoccupation en ce sens que l'économie béninoise et sa résilience sont fondamentalement dépendantes de l'agriculture et des ressources forestières. Quelques éléments qui permettent donc de confirmer.
Resilience is of particular importance and confirms that these projects depend on agriculture in particular. And we also had a census where we also counted the land surface, and we found that 70% of the jobs depend on land use, on agriculture. This means that the land and everything which is involved is indispensable. In Benin, many soils need to be restored because of overuse, and we risk our land and water resources by exploiting the land. With the help of GIZ, we measured which soils are especially in need of restoration. And because of mapping, we found out where this land is and what the forestry share is on them.
Une zone fortement dégradée, mais qui correspond en même temps à la zone où se retrouvent la plupart des forêts classées.
In the areas which are particularly in need of restoration and which are often located in forests which are already protected, we measured exactly how much these soils have been depleted. And for this purpose, we identified 3 goals, which I would like to share with you. For us, this is mainly about restoring 50% of the affected soils in the reference period and to reduce soil loss to 7%.
Alors, il faut dire qu'avec l'accompagnement de nos partenaires,
and then to increase soil cover by 12%, especially in areas where erosion has made progress.
de gérer donc ces contraintes-là et de faire face utilement et efficacement.
Our government introduced a plan, and with this plan, it is possible to cater to these needs effectively. However, we still have a lot of land tenure issues which are still pending and need to be sorted out. There are still some weak points in the forest areas. This means that we need an integrated mechanism which also takes into account the communities living in these forests, because often we lack an inclusive and participatory approach. So this is what I wanted to share with you, and I hope I didn't exceed my speaking time. So thank you very much for your attention.
Merci à vous pour votre présentation. It was perfectly on time. Thanks a lot. And I would also like to repeat some of your key messages. One is talking about resilience in order to ensure food security and income, because 70%, as you have mentioned, of the people in an area you have presented are living from agriculture and from forests. And this underlines the importance of land tenure in this affected area. Thank you very much. It is now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. She is from Madagascar, Hanitra Rasafinhahandra. She is the Director of Reforestation, Landscape and Forest Management in the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development. And I know you have prepared a presentation. Hanitra, the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup de m'avoir donné la parole pour présenter le cas de Madagascar.
Thank you, Chair, for giving me the floor.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor to speak about
to explain to you
and to talk about LDN and also the land use right for the use of soils. In Madagascar, we have a unique variety of species, unique biodiversity, which is, however, under a lot of pressure right now. And with regard to LDM, land degradation neutrality, we also have some special targets and some special characteristics, in particular the improvement of biodiversity and the carbon status, also better infrastructure, the reduction of the conversion of other types of vegetation cover, or the reduction of the conversion of wetlands to other types of vegetation by 2030. This is our main goal in the area of LDN targets. We have launched some measures. We included the LDN principles into the land use planning, and we also included this principle into the design and the implementation of our policies and strategies in the individual sectors in order to achieve such neutrality. Every year, we allocated at least 200,000 hectares of land to sustainable agriculture And every year we restore 400,000 hectares of landscapes for green infrastructure. We also strengthen cross-sectoral innovation capacities through sustainable land management in order to make sure there is more innovation in this area and in order to find solutions. On the ground, there are also some initiatives, for instance, initiatives for the conservation of biodiversity, which are specifically based in Madagascar. We also have a strategy to reduce deforestation and to improve soil quality by changing land uses so that they are better adapted to our ecosystems. We also have programs for sustainable land management, mid-small-scale action, because we do not have enough resources for large-scale measures. We also are confronted with some challenges. First of all, we found that we need an enabling environment to foster our traditional practices. And also to minimize impact. Partager la planification territoriale et le transfert de capacité pour la décentralisation. Therefore, we see a need of a shared vision on territorial planning and also of transferring capacities through decentralization of natural resources management. The land is a common heritage, and we need to make sure that sustainable solutions are found and that in regional planning and land use, land degradation neutrality is respected. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation and for introducing the topic of commons, common heritage, common goods into our discussion. Thanks a lot. Now we are trying to hand over to our next speaker, to Dedi Kamoto from Malawi. He was online in the introductory round, and now we might have lost him. He had informed us this morning that there are heavy rains in Malawi, and therefore the internet connection is not always stable. So I'm trying to reach out to him. Teddy, can you hear us? Are you still online? He is missing, and he's not online at the moment, so we will try to bring him in a little bit later. We will try to reconnect. What I would like to do is now to start with our panel discussion. What I have heard in all of your presentations is that there is a potential of conflicts. The international agreement on achieving land degradation neutrality, your ambitious plans in the countries, they are from time to time confronted with local realities. People are living on degraded lands. People are living in degraded forests. And when this land degradation neutrality needs to be implemented, you need to deal with the realities on the ground. And therefore, my first question to you is, you have referred in different ways to conflict resolutions. Could you please explain to us how you are going to deal with the potential conflict that in an area which is, according to the cataster, according to the maps, is a protected area, and there you see people living in the forests. Therefore, how are you going to deal with these conflicts? What are your experiences? This is my first question to the panelists, and may I ask Lucy maybe to first provide an answer, and then I'm going over to Hanitra. Lucy, what is your experience in dealing with conflicts and conflict resolutions?
Yes, thank you very much. Congratulations to my colleagues for really letting us also know what is happening to other parts of this continent. The conflict is definitely there, and these conflicts present a very tough political decision for the political decision-making, environmental decision-making, social decision-making, socio-economic, because it's about livelihood. And when you have communities living in those ecosystems that are degraded, from the environmental aspect, you want to restore them, for their good, actually, for the future. But of course, livelihood is about today and now. And then, of course, now the planning there comes in. The challenge is there, but I think more it's about the policies that we put across. When we implement the UNCC Convention decision, in implementing them, we need to mainstream them to a point where the local communities understand what needs to be done. And also those policies must be sensitive enough to their lifestyle, to their livelihoods, to their way of living. Whether they're inside the forest, if they're adjacent to the forest, that understanding of the political, environmental, and the social decision that is made, there must be participatory consultation in doing that.
Thanks a lot, Lucy. Hanitra, the same question goes to you. How are you going to deal with potential conflicts? You mentioned the common heritage. What have you set up as a conflict resolution in Madagascar to deal with achieving land degradation neutrality and the rights of people on their land?
Oui, merci à cette question. Donc, pour Madagascar,
Thank you.
Il y a la planification territoriale.
In Madagascar, we have a land planning system which is integrative. That is to say, it is inclusive. We also include land tenure rights in our land planning systems, and the communities living in these regions too. We always consult our communities, and then we take joint decisions how to make use of these soils and of the land. This way, we usually find a solution for the use of these areas after having talked to the local authorities and after having achieved agreement with the inhabitants, as well as with private enterprises, private businesses working there. At the moment, this process is being introduced all over Madagascar, but in some areas we already have this inclusive land planning system. And as I said before, this is happening at a small scale only at the moment, but we have good conditions in place in order to be able to implement this inclusive land planning system all over the country. And this was also the reason why we introduced or set up our working group. Various governmental sectors are cooperating in this group to shape this new land planning system and also to allow for a sustainable land use in order to avoid land degradation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Hanitra. I would like now to go to our colleague from Benin, Alastair. You have mentioned mapping. You have mentioned measuring degradation. So it seems that in Benin, you are going ahead with a very well-structured approach to find out what is the real situation on the ground. Could you briefly inform us what type of conflicts you have found when looking at protected forest areas, for example, where people are living and where they have secondary rights, land use rights, while living in a protected area?
Bien sûr. Bien sûr, bien sûr. Bien sûr. Merci beaucoup, Alexander. C'est vrai que...
Yes, of course. Thanks a lot indeed. Yes, it's true, there are conflicts on the ground, in particular when it comes using and administering the projects on the ground. And we also see that as regards the question of forestry resources. Our systems continue to show weaknesses depending on the type of conflicts. We will have to find ways and means to overcome that conflict, and there are still conflicts which are still going on. One conflict would be an attack of hunters engaging in poaching or illegal hunting activities. And as you know, the fauna is seriously threatened. And then we end up with a threat for the overall ecosystem. And this leads to an increased degradation of soils. One way of avoiding such attacks or of dealing with poachers is to take action in local communities. This is to say, to set up kind of a protection team, to form a protection team with the support of the local population on the ground. This is not about a task force coming from outside. No, it's the members of the community who were received education and were taught in this field through the various organizations, and they have been shown which types of species should not be threatened by hunters. This is a solution which allows for protecting fauna and animal species. And the second dimension of this conflict, and this is about a conflict which is for real. Some people are looking for arable land. And this is why at the moment we are trying to find a solution in this respect. Communities are to protect soil fertility, are to increase soil, enhance soil fertility with regard to the arable farming sector and land use. I would like to thank TMG Research and BMZ, because this network in the last few years between 2015 and 2021 participated in research projects with the respective funds, developing programs to offset the loss of soils and to avoid the loss of soils, because Land degradation leads to a situation where communities look for new soils, new land, and degrade new areas. So we wanted to show that it's possible and important to develop agricultural methods which are not intensive but extensive.
Thank you for the explanation.
However, we don't want to give incentives to the population to enter the forests and live there and engage in farming activities there. Thank you.
So thanks a lot for the explanation. We have some questions from participants in our chat, and I would like to present two of the questions and then ask the panelists to provide answers. The first question is how to effectively ensure that offset programs, such as REDD+, or also attempts of big industry to offset their carbon emissions, do not come at the expense of, among others, indigenous populations. So in the global north, more and more companies want to do offsetting, sequester carbon in the ground to balance their emissions. How to ensure that this does not come at the expense of people living on the land? That's the first question. And the second goes into a more general direction. How are we going to deal with the issue of climatic migration? The question was linked to Madagascar, but I think I could ask all three panelists. So do you have experience with offsetting programs where farmers get paid for carbon sequestration? And do you have experience with people migrating because of changing climatic conditions? May I ask Lucy to start, to be followed by Hanitra and then Alastair. Offsetting and migration. Lucy, and please within 1 or 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this is, yeah, you are very right. This is an area that we are getting, like even by yesterday, there are entities calling even from outside the country with this interest of establishing carbon offset kind of engagements. And from where I sit, I have 1 or 2 things to say. One is that as a country, we need to tighten up and polish our policy that will guide that kind of engagement to safeguard, not just the forests themselves, but the communities that are, are within that environment. There's need for awareness, and awareness is not just about communities. Even from policy level, when this engagement is coming, how is it going to benefit the medium and the long-term benefits that are entrenched there? And therefore, allow that to ensure that the large lights, even as we do all this, even as we get into the offsetting engagements, that the large sites are also safeguarded.
Thanks a lot for this very precise answer. Hanitra, carbon offsetting and refugees migration because of climate change.
Merci. Donc, concernant les compensations carbone, Madagascar.
Thank you, Chair. As regards carbon offsetting, we in Madagascar have a strategy called REDD+. This is about reducing CO2 emissions and deforestation. This is about avoiding all this, and the benefits of this program are really to the benefit of the local population. It benefits from these carbon offsetting programs, and this is already being implemented within the framework of the REDD+ program to the benefit of the local population. As regards the second question. What do we do in Madagascar with regard to this question? We already have a national political strategy on setting up public safeties Madagascar also has a vision on how to secure land rights and how to protect soils. We want to reduce these attacks, if you like, on the land as much as possible. This is about sharing information in case of insecurities. And now as to the third question, climate migration and climate refugees. We have a development plan in the south of Madagascar. Here we can improve things which come about because of climate change. There is little arable land left there, and the Ministry for Development and the Ministry of Sustainable Development and Environment has set up a sustainability plan for the management of arable land. With this plan, it is intended to stabilize the sandy soils there. And we also planned to continue with these activities for at least 5 years so that we can implement the respective conditions. And in order to be able to make use of these soils as arable land for agroforestry, farming, but also for cultivating fast-growing plants in the watershed areas which are located in these areas, which are heavily damaged by climate change. As to migration, we need to set up positive conditions in the south to avoid migration into other directions. Because what we need to do here is to avoid people from making use of the forests, because in the forests we can see that internal migration leads to a lot of disadvantages because people tend to settle down in the forests and establish arable land there, but we have to protect our forestry soils.
Thanks a lot. Sorry for interrupting you. We only have 6 more minutes, and I have received a question directed to Benin. The question is, how does Benin plan to collaborate with farmers in searching for new arable land in terms of securing land tenure? So my understanding is if farmers are looking for new land, how to secure their land tenure rights. May I ask you, Alastair, to, within 2 minutes, to try to answer this complex question?
Merci beaucoup, Alexander. C'est vrai que avec le niveau de dégradation avancé des terres, nous avons sans cesse des agriculteurs qui voient l'assaut de nouvelles terres, ce qui les pousse donc à avancer parfois dans des zones qui sont considérées comme état classées. Mais aussi, je voudrais lier cette question aussi à la question de migration climatique qui fait qu'au Bénin, et ça entraîne beaucoup de conflits, notamment entre les éleveurs et les agriculteurs, les éleveurs qui sont à la recherche donc, de pâturage.
There are many conflicts among farmers
Ça dépend de là où on se trouve, de leur pouvoir de transhumance pour
and agricultural businesses, depending on where they are. For example, pastoralist roads and paths. So many farmers are looking for new arable land. In Benin, we don't have a solution for this yet. What we did is that we set up a European commissioner, an institution that was 1 year ago, which is to support us. We need to channel expertise in this respect as regards conflicts between the farming sector, husbandry, animal keepers, and we need to find solutions for farmers, and at the same time, we need to protect pastoralists, because this is the problem we are faced with, and this is why 2 months ago the Euro Commissioner was set up, and we are happy that we will be able to share part of our solutions shortly. But at the moment, I can only explain to you that we will have results shortly and not yet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear colleagues, dear participants in the live stream. The hour is close to being over. We have 3 more minutes. First of all, I would like to thank all panelists for their valuable contributions, for sharing their insights. And I'm going to try now to draw some very general conclusions. First conclusion, there is a growing consensus that achieving food security and adaptation to climate change requires investment in landscape restoration at scale. Successful landscape restoration, that's my second conclusion, needs to be rights-based. If land rights are not considered in landscape restoration, the restoration efforts might fail. We have the experience from RED+, and other activities, and they show us that if legitimate tenure rights are not taken into account, they might contradict restoration efforts and at the same time endanger food security. Third message, however, if we include legitimate rights and if we take into account conflict resolutions, land degradation neutrality, restoration of ecosystems has the potential to support food security and to improve the livelihoods of the people. Or to say it in simple words, whenever we talk about restoration and land degradation neutrality, we have to think about people. It's the people living on the ground. The people can become very valuable assets when they see that their rights are considered and that in the end, land degradation neutrality leads to the improvement of their livelihoods. One could say all politics are local, and the implementation of land degradation neutrality requires active participation of people on the ground. And let us be aware there are conflicts. And the way we are dealing with the conflicts, your great contributions have showed it, will make the way towards effective landscape restoration. People and landscape restoration have to be thought together. Thanks a lot to the panelists. Thanks a lot to the participants. We could have discussed it a lot longer, and I really hope that we can see the results of your work. And as Michael Grake has said in the beginning, Africa is leading the way towards landscape restoration, and they are also showcasing how to deal with local realities and to turn conflicts into potentials. Thanks a lot to all our participants. Thanks a lot to BMZ for supporting it. Thanks a lot to GIZ for the technical support for the work on the ground. Hope to see you soon live, and let us continue to exchange and work on land degradation neutrality and people's rights. Thanks a lot. Enjoy your day. Thank you. Bye-bye.